Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm so thrilled you've joined me tonight for another fabulous story, because as I always say, nothing in this world beats a good story. It's just something that's a feel-good factor in our lives that so easily can be overlooked, but without a story, life is never nearly as good. And let's get started with our story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Eugenie sat up with a start, climbed out of bed, and drew back the curtains from her bedroom window with a sharp, forceful tug, so that the long, elegant sweep of luxury white cotton material rolled back smoothly on the railing. She leaned forward to peer outside of the second-floor window of her double-story farmhouse. They should be home, she thought. Where the hell have they got to? She had not meant to fall asleep for this long, but the moment her head had hit the pillow, she'd been out like a light. That was the problem when you were a first-time mum with a bonny bairn to raise. The 24/7 required your undivided attention. You were perpetually exhausted. It's not easy getting a good night's sleep at the very best of times. The evidence was clearly seen on Eugenie's face, where the area around her eyes was beginning to resemble a raccoon. She barely recognized the fatigued face that stared back at her in the mirror. Her shoulder-length brown hair looked as if it had lost its shiny luster. Her eyes were puffy and red, her complexion very pale. Everyone of late had commented how sleep-deprived she looked. "Sweetheart," her mother had said, "I really think you need to get some help. Looking after a wee bairn is a lot of work. Don't be too ashamed or too proud to hire a babysitter. But where you're going, I'm not entirely sure you can get such a luxury for yourself." The way her mother was talking, it was almost as if she and Luton were moving to Timbuktu. "Believe me, darling, being sleep-deprived is no laughing matter," she had told her daughter earnestly. "I know what I'm talking about because I was a mother once myself. You had a pair of lungs on you, louder than a seagull. And I'm not joking either. I was worse than you. I was going around the place like a complete zombie, until finally I admitted I needed help." Emmy, Eugenie's 1-year-old, was inclined to wake Eugenie up in the middle of the night, screaming like a banshee. No one had prepared Eugenie for what it was like to be a mother with a screaming baby on your hands that seemed impossible to console. She had woken feeling rested and refreshed, but rather disorientated, befuddled and confused, not knowing if it was the early hours of the morning or the evening. But a quick glance at the shining red digits on the bedside table declared the time to be 7:30 p.m. Had she really been asleep for that long? Surely not. The farmhouse was steeped in darkness. Everything was unusually quiet. She seemed to remember her husband muttering something about taking Emmy for a walk in the pram to get some fresh air. "It'll be the quintessential opportunity for you to get some much-needed rest while I'm out," he told her. "Look at you. You're completely bushed. A sight for sore eyes you are. Now you need to get some quality sleep while I'm gone. I shan't be long." He had pulled the curtains closed in her bedroom and leaned over and kissed her on the cheek. She had caught a whiff of his musky aftershave, heard the front door slam behind him, the wheels of the pram rolling away, and then he was gone. She had slipped off to sleep moments later. But they should have been back ages ago, shouldn't they? It was pitch black outside her bedroom. She could barely see her hand in front of her face. She could only see the shape of the ottoman at the end of the bed, and the tenebrific outline of the sofa and chair in the far side of the bedroom. But beyond that, she was staring out into a dark abyss or void. As she stood at the window, she was hoping to see a spot of activity outside, to hear the familiar, reassuring sound of Emmy's stroller being wheeled back to the front door, and her husband Luton's keys being rattled in the lock. But there was not a sound to be heard, not even the distant hoot of an owl, the wail of a coyote, and not for that matter could she hear the tuneful chorus of crickets and frogs which she had heard every other day of the night. Until now, for they were not singing. It would seem in the dark puddle of this dim, gloomy expanse that surrounded her like an inky blanket, The silence was deafening. It screamed out to her that something was intrinsically wrong, and the echoes of that prognostication seemed to almost bounce against the wall of her chest like a tennis ball, as a voice whispered inside her, "Something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong." "Where are they?" she thought, pressing her rather elegant upturned nose against the window pane, where she left a smudge mark on the glass. She couldn't see a damn thing out there. The moon appeared to have lost its pearly luminescence, and was hiding in the shadows like a lampshade covered with a dark veil, while the stars had reticently buried themselves beneath the folds of the pewter clouds like ocean snails on the seashore. It was as if the bright sparkling jewels of the firmament had hesitantly sensed the lugubrious foreboding of the atmosphere, and had hurriedly retreated into the clouds for safe cover, almost giving the sense that she should do the very same, rushing around the house, drawing curtains, fastening windows, and checking everything was safely locked. Either that, or Eugenie's exaggerated sense of apprehension was taunting, teasing, and twisting her mind for no reason at all, and she was irrationally envisaging the macabre kind of horrors she'd only ever entertained when she was a kid, that had no bearing on reality whatsoever. In that moment, it felt as if she'd been robbed of her safety, for a creeping sense of impending dread seemed to be trailing and winding itself through every nerve cell of her body like a burgeoning vine. She had never felt like this before, as she concluded that anything could be out there, hiding within those dark shadows. Her heartbeat began to flutter wildly in her chest like a colony of butterflies. She had never enjoyed the dark at the very best of times, but out here in the countryside, in the middle of nowhere, it was all-consuming and exceedingly intimidating. But where was her husband? For so long she had been a city girl, used to the noisy honks of taxicabs, the fast-moving sounds of the traffic, the bright lights of the Big Apple. Indeed, it was all she'd ever known, and what she was comfortably accustomed to. But something about this untamed wild night left the hairs on the back of her neck standing up on end. It's a pity they didn't have a dog. She knew animals were quick to pick up smells, sounds, strange vibrations that others did not see or hear. At least a dog, if it was barking tirelessly, would confirm to her that she was not going completely mad, that her sense of foreboding was not completely unreasonable. Was it natural to feel so on edge like this? She couldn't be sure. She hadn't lived in the countryside long enough to know what was normal, what was not. She and her husband had moved here only a week ago, but he had never left her on her own before, like this in a country farmhouse, far away from everything. Suddenly she tasted trepidation for the very first time in her life. It was a bitter pill to have to swallow. It didn't help that the outside light had blown the previous night, of all things, and needed replacing, and so there was no outside light to subdue the inky fog that seemed to be hemming in the house from every side. An uneasy trepidation clawed its way up the back of Eugenie's spine, slipping smoothly like butter into the back of her throat, where an ominous queasy lump had developed. A fretful, disturbing sense of disquiet seemed to overwhelm her, but she shook it off as if it was a buzzing fly that had landed on her shoulder, and she was swatting away. "Don't be silly," she told herself. "You're overreacting, Eugenie. You know you are. You're just not used to life in the countryside. That's what this is all about. Luton is absolutely fine. So is Emmy. It might be dark out there, but there's no such thing as werewolves, headless horsemen, ghosts or ghoulies. Even Freddy Krueger is legendary. These things only existed in fairy tales and in our imaginations, where the spurious seeds of such morbid creations have been birthed into some of our fictional books and movies by authors of note. But none of this stuff is real. Everybody knows that. And for me to consider such things is madness, she thought, even as she told herself this very sternly, as if reprimanding a mischievous child. It would seem merely thinking such unsavoury thoughts or giving them brief reference had unwittingly allowed those images to creep into her mind, like spilt milk spreading across a kitchen floor. If you tell someone not to think about a pink elephant, then they invariably will. That's the way the brain actually works. Eugenie shuddered as Freddy Krueger's gormless grin appeared in her mind, with a lucidity that was quite terrifying. Out here they were miles away from everywhere, and it struck her that being so remote, it would take a while for the police to get out here in time should she need to call them for help. By all accounts, she'd happily call them right now if she could. But what would she say without sounding completely foolish or like a hypochondriac? "It's dark out here. I'm scared. My husband and daughter haven't returned home yet." She could almost hear the local police having a chuckle at her expense. "Ha! New York girl. Moved to the countryside out here. Scared witless of her own shadow. Poor thing. These people, they're not cut out for country life. They're clueless. Why they move out here to Montana, God only knows. Have they no sense? They're better off living in the city, where they're used to the consolingly comforting sound of the background noise of the traffic. If they hear a coyote or something like that, they think they're about to be attacked." She didn't want the police in these parts to think she was a neurotic urbanite who couldn't handle the rhythms of the natural world, and thought monsters were surreptitiously loitering around in the woods. The nearest town was 35 minutes away. What if out of the shadows her worst fears were realized? Eugenie had learnt over the years to talk to herself when she felt rattled and diseased about something, and it always seemed to be self-soothing for her. What was it she had heard once on a documentary before about fear? She tried to remind herself. Ah, yes, the specialist had reassured his audience of viewers that it was very rare for the things you actually feared to bear any fruit or to be realized in our reality. The specialist's words were scant comfort for her right now, when she was worrying about the whereabouts of her husband and baby. If only they would come home! Where the hell were they? How could her husband do this to her, be gone for so long, and cause her to worry like this? Did they have any clue how late it actually was? How could her husband be so inconsiderate, so cruel? She began to glance apprehensively at her cell phone, hoping it would suddenly light up and start ringing, and that she would look at the caller ID to see her husband's name. But no such luck. She tried to phone her husband's cell phone several times, and wanted to scream when she received just a voicemail message. She barked down the phone. "Where the hell are you, Luton? I'm worried sick. I'm all on my own in this farmhouse. It's dark outside, and you're nowhere to be seen. How can you do this to me? I'm freaking out, wondering where you are. I'm bloody worried, and this is no joke. This is no joke." She suddenly began to feel incredibly annoyed with her husband. She had a right to feel this way. She had a right to feel bereft. If he'd met up with someone, could he have not at the very least phoned her, had the courtesy just to do that? But who would he meet up with out here? Maybe my husband bumped into one of the locals on a walking trail. Who knows? Got talking and was persuaded to go back with that person for drinks. People were very friendly out here. Maybe her husband had not phoned because he wanted her to have an opportunity to sleep, and his call might have disturbed her. Of course, that's what this was. Even so, overlooking the common courtesy of leaving her a message was very wrong. She'd kill him when he walked through the door. She'd bloody kill him. All she could see from her bedroom window were tenebrific views of this uneasy night in front of her. The wild countryside rolled away to be absorbed by the gloom of twilight. The farmhouse had generously been left to her husband by his uncle Angus, that had raised him as a young boy. It would seem Luton was thrilled to be back here, as if his greatest longing had been realized. She had seen his eyes light up like sparklers when they moved into the farmhouse, and it had occurred to her how attached he was to this place, as she suspected that every wooden beam of the house held within its grain the indelible memories of the joyful times he'd spent here with his uncle and his aunt, both who were tragically now deceased. The world was so cruel sometimes when people you loved so much were taken fortuitously from your life long before their time. As her father had always warned her growing up, that death was no respecter of persons or age. It was an intrinsic part of life, guaranteed to happen to everyone on the planet. Some left the earth early, others late. It was devastating for her husband that the man he had loved so much had flown to Australia and developed a thrombosis in his leg, from sitting in the same position for hours on end. In the flight, pretzeled between two inconsiderate people, who seemed as if they were stuck to their seats with superglue, and had bladders on them that would make a rhinoceros impressed. Uncle Angus had been typically too polite to ask them to move, so he could stretch his long legs, which very well might have saved his life, had he not remained squeezed between these two people, barely able to move a muscle, like a pressed wild flower between two books. Unbeknown to him, a lethal blood clot had formed. He was tragically found lying dead in a Sydney hotel room, only hours later, obliviously unaware that being squashed up for so long had had deadly consequences. It had hit her husband hard to lose the man he'd loved like a father. Luton's uncle had agreed to adopt Luton from his little sister, who'd fallen pregnant at 16 years old, after getting drunk at a friend's house. She had no memory of the event, nor who the father was. She had begged her older brother, 15 years her senior, to adopt her baby, as she was too young to be a mother, and she did not want to hand Luton over for adoption to a perfect stranger, and she'd refused point blank to have an abortion. Luton had been raised by Angus and his wife Tara, but Tara had tragically died of an asthmatic attack when Luton was in his early 20s, so both the people he regarded as his beloved parents had been wiped off the face of the earth, like raindrops on a car windscreen that were now permanently gone. It had hit her husband hard, and for a long while he had been inconsolable with grief, blaming God for his uncle's demise. Over the last week, after having moved back into the farmhouse, it would seem that Eugenie's husband had reverted back to his childhood, for he was behaving like an irresponsible boy with an irrepressible, unbridled enthusiasm, wearing a childlike grin on his face all the time that was so wide she was surprised it actually fit. Luton looked like a contented, satisfied man that had finally returned home. She also suspected being back at the farmhouse made him feel close to his deceased uncle and aunt. He would tell her he could almost smell his uncle's aftershave and feel their energy. "Maybe it's wishful thinking," he said, "but I still feel them around. Is that mad?" "Maybe they are here," said Eugenie. "All there is between this world and the next is a veil. That's what I heard once. I don't see why it shouldn't be true. My bet is he's watching over you. That's why you feel him." "You think so?" asked Luton, looking terribly pleased. "Look, I'm no psychic. I don't know about these things," said Eugenie. "But I honestly don't see why not." In New York, Luton had never been this relaxed or carefree, as if when he was in the city he had not truly been himself. But out here he had changed exponentially. He just seemed more authentic and less guarded about things. Indeed, since they'd moved here, Luton kept disappearing to explore this, to investigate that. In truth, it had been beginning to get her back up. They needed to unpack, and Luton had been as helpful as a tick on a dog's coat. "I want to see if the stone arrangement I made in the quarry is still there," he had told her excitedly. "Imagine if the stones have not been removed for 10 years. Wouldn't that be incredible?" Then he wanted to see if the oak tree still had his name on the bark. "I want to check out the wooden house my uncle built me in the woods, to see if it's still intact. If it's damaged, I'm sure I can fix it for Emmy, when she's old enough to use it. It's a tree house, of course. That's what I'm talking about." "But Luton, can you not do all that another time?" she'd complained. "I need your help around the place." She could see the smile on her husband's face dissipate like the steam from a kettle. She had felt bad to see his abject disappointment. "Please, sweetheart, can't the packing wait? Can't we do it another day? We're out in the country. We don't need to rush, do we?" "All right, go," she'd said, waving her hand as if to shoo him away. Once again his face had lit up like a Christmas tree. He had rushed over to kiss her affectionately on the cheek. "What did I do to deserve you, Eugenie? I must have been a saint in my previous life. I won't be gone long. You're the most amazing wife in the entire world. You know that." Eugenie had laughed, a pretty musical laugh. Her green eyes had crinkled up in her pretty heart-shaped face. "Flattery will get you everywhere, Luton. That's why you use it on me all the time," she teased. "And every time you'd think I'd learn. But no, your smooth tongue can talk me around every time. You go before I change my mind and force you to help me get through those damn boxes. It's a minefield. I don't know where to start. I should have marked them better. Now I don't know what's where, and it's a nightmare to find anything. I should have let my mother pack for me. Then I wouldn't be in this dreadful pickle. Luton had left his wife alone in the farmhouse with Emmy, and she had to unpack all the boxes on her own. She knew it was an unenviable position with so many boxes to be unpacked, and still some old stuff of Uncle Angus's to be boxed up and given to charity or just thrown away. The good quality furnishings in the house were in great nick, and they had happily claimed them as their own. Suffice to say her husband's promises of not being gone for long were never fulfilled, as he'd be gone for hours on end, and she suspected as much. She knew Luton had no concept of time, and ate through it as fast as a caterpillar in an apple, and would likely think he'd only been gone for minutes when he'd been away for hours. Her husband did not seem to appreciate that for a woman, her natural nesting instinct and the need to be settled was significantly important. That's why she needed to unpack. Eugenie didn't want to spend weeks on end rifling through cardboard boxes looking for the electric cord or for the food processor, so she resigned herself to the grim prospect that unpacking would be left entirely to her. She had delighted in seeing her husband's jubilant face as he reappeared in the farmhouse hours later, his cheeks flushed bright pink with windswept hair and a couple of crisp autumn leaves tangled up in his collar. There was no way she could reprimand a face like that. "Oh, my God," he told her. "You're not going to believe it, Eugenie. The arrangement of stones I made in the quarry all those long years ago has not been touched, changed, or removed. It's as if I built it yesterday," he told her with a huge grin on his face. "My God, that is incredible. Don't you think it's bloody incredible?" Eugenie had nodded. "I suppose so," she admitted, but clandestinely wondered how anyone could get so excited about a whole heap of stones. Was it really such a great big deal? Luton seemed to think it was. "You should see the wood grove, Eugenie," said Luton, his voice betraying his huge enthusiasm. "Some of those sizable lofty trees have grown into substantial monsters. Never seen the woods so mesmerizing before. I'm so glad we moved here, Eugenie. Thanks for giving our stint here in the country a chance. I know we're going to be happy here. It really is as if fate has given us a nudge in the right direction. There are no huge payments, no extortionate rental costs on our tiny two-bedroom apartment in Manhattan. This place is in excellent nick, as Uncle Angus was punctilious, had exceptionally good taste in furnishings and style. In the beginning it'll be tough, I admit, as you don't know many people in this part of the world, but people here are terribly friendly, and I can introduce you to a few locals I knew growing up. In no time you'll have lots of friends, and with social media being so good these days, you can speak to your family every day if you want to. Think about it. Emmy will grow up in nature, learning that trees don't just grow through cracks in the paving, and that tadpoles develop into frogs, and that raccoons have night vision. Here we are financially free, and you don't have to go back to your god-awful marketing job you didn't even enjoy, with its pathetic meagre wage. You were never happy there, and that demanding boss, Mr. Norris, expected you to work beyond office hours, and he never paid you more for that. It was a joke. I know you love this place, Luton, and I'm thrilled you do, but don't worry about me. Only time will tell if it works out for us or not. But you're right. I am glad not to be slaving away at that useless job that I didn't even particularly like. And as for Mr. Norris, I don't miss him at all. I'm looking forward to getting creative in the kitchen and taking Emmy for long country walks. It's going to be fun, and certainly a good experience. Luton had spoken about his uncle's place to Eugenie over the years with so much fondness. "Oh, you have no idea what an amazing childhood I had," he told her over 100 times. He was beginning to sound like a broken record. "I grew up in this incredible farmhouse in Montana with Uncle Angus and Aunt Tara. No one had a better childhood than I did. I so wish we could raise our kids in a place like that. It would be magical. New York is no place to raise children. What does it have to offer young kids but concrete jungles, cars, and all that unhealthy exhaust stuff? What do they call it? Exhaust fumes, that's right. To breathe in. Not terribly nice. Don't talk about New York like that, Eugenie had said defensively. I love New York. Always have and always will. You forget. I grew up here. This place is in my blood. It's part of me. It has a heartbeat and a vibe and a thriving metropolis. I'll have you know it's not a concrete jungle as you claim. That's a cruel way to describe New York. That's mean. That would mean it has no atmosphere, no indelible signature from the past on our present. And that's not true. New York is steeped in a rich, vibrant history. The Victorian Flatbush in Brooklyn, Central Park's historic district in Manhattan, old-timey Astor in Harlem, and the brownstone apartments of 108 West and 75th Street. How can you say that this is a concrete jungle? It's a masterpiece of architecture with such a very ambitious history. I won't have you demean New York. This is where I grew up. You don't know it like I did. You've only lived here for a few years. I've lived here my entire life. I'm sorry, but I take offence to your insinuations. And for the record, I had a phenomenal childhood growing up here, as do other kids that live in New York. It's a great place to grow up, and there's a hell of a lot to do here. Much more than being stuck in the middle of the countryside, I can assure you of that. You don't have to get so prickly with me, Eugenie. I'm just saying fresh air and countryside is good for our bodies. Growing up, I would swim in the lake, lift up rocks to see what kind of creepy crawly lay beneath. Literally run around the countryside collecting eggs from the chickens. You can't do that here. Well, not really. It had been Luton's idea for them to move to the farmhouse in Montana for 6 months to see if they could adapt to country life. If they couldn't, they'd sell up and return to the Big Apple. Luton could work from his computer from home, so it didn't matter where the couple lived. Location was not a problem. With Luton's job working with ancient manuscripts and books from the past, he could be camped out in the middle of the Mediterranean, and it wouldn't matter a jot. Eugenie had not been keen to come to Montana at first, to move away from friends and family. But Luton believed a child should grow up in the natural world, close to nature, and Eugenie decided to give it a go. What could it hurt? It was an experiment, and if it worked out for them, all well and good. If it didn't, they'd return to New York, wiser from the experience, having gained much insight. But the truth was, once it got close to the moving date, something began to niggle at Eugenie, but she dismissed her sense of foreboding and trepidation as understandable nerves when embracing such a big change. It hadn't helped, of course, that her parents were dead set against the couple's desire to leave New York. Eugenie's mother had felt the spontaneous move was a very bad idea, as had her father. But to be fair, they had their own invested interests in mind. They didn't want to be too far away from their beloved grandchild, and Eugenie understood their concerns in this regard. In their shoes she would likely feel very much the same. "Sweetheart, I think it's a dreadful idea. You're going to live in Montana. Your father and I have discussed this together, and we know it is none of our business, but we think you're making a grievous mistake. We believe you will be terribly lonely far away from friends and family. New York is such a wonderful place to raise a wee little bairn, and I would be a fabulous babysitter for you if the two of you needed to go out on a date night or something." Eugenie's father had let out a huge sigh, rubbing his white walrus moustache rather reflectively. The crinkles around his blue eyes scrunched together. He took a long drawn-out puff of his aromatic cigar, blowing out a long ribbon of white smoke. He considered his words carefully and then said, "Your mother's absolutely right, Eugenie. I know it is none of our business what you do with your life, but in my opinion it's madness throwing everything away to go and live in the country. You have a great job here, Eugenie, and have rented a very nice 2-bedroom apartment in Manhattan. Why would you want to leave all that? Montana can be a very lonely place. I think you'll be tearing your hair out with boredom. Besides, you don't know any people in Montana.
I think Luton has not thought this through properly enough. This move is so impulsive, so ill-considered, so last-minute, if you ask me. It's like jumping from the fire into the frying pan. I would think about it very carefully if I were you, Eugenie. It seems all very last-minute. Let's see. Luton's uncle dies. You go to the poor man's funeral. He then leaves his farmhouse to you in his will. And the next thing is you're bloody moving to the place. Why does Luton not sell the damn farmhouse or rent it out to holiday makers visiting Montana? Why all this dreadful rush to abandon your place here in New York? Do you realize how irrational this all is? I don't think the two of you are thinking straight. Why don't you sell the farmhouse, buy a nice place in New York with the funds you raise? I don't think that your mother and I will be very happy with you being so far away. And even though I don't agree with your mother about many things, including her ridiculous political allegiances,
Mum, Dad,
which leave
listen
much
to the
to be
both of
desired,
you. You both
on
sound
this
like a broken
subject,
record.
I wholeheartedly
said Eugenie
agree with her.
obsequiously. You're acting as if I'm leaving New York for good. I told you it's a trial. We'll live in Montana for 6 months. If we hate it, we'll come back to New York. You must try see this from Luton's perspective, will you? He grew up in that farmhouse. He loves the bones of the place. He doesn't want to sell it. It's in his blood, like New York is in mine. I promise you, since I've known him, he's spoken of little else but the farmhouse where he grew up as a boy. I owe it to him, and I owe it to us, and I owe it to little Emmy to give it a chance. Otherwise, I'm being unfair. But, sweetheart, don't you see? Your husband is being exceedingly unreasonable. Listen to yourself, darling. Luton this, Luton that. You're sounding as if you're completely under your husband's persuasions, as if you don't have a mind of your own, as if you don't even have a single say in the matter. I think Luton is being incredibly selfish, very self-centered. Sorry, but I have to say what me and your father are thinking. Now, don't get me wrong. I like Luton very much indeed. He's quite the charmer, but he can be terribly, terribly selfish at times. He's thinking about what he wants alone, and is very inconsiderate. What's best for him is all that matters to him. What about for you, for us, for the entire family, for our grandchild? I think not. If the truth be told, Eugenie, I've known you all your life, my darling, and I know a life in the countryside is not suitable for you. You're not cut out for it. I remember when we went on that camping trip to Yellowstone National Park all those years ago. You were champing at the bit to get home. You couldn't get home fast enough. You loathed the countryside. Don't you remember you fell on a moss-covered stone in the water at that stream? You grazed your poor knees. They were bleeding very badly. You got soaked to the skin. Then you were stung by a bee later that day, and you got a huge swelling on your arm. And then you got angry because you couldn't keep up with us on a walk. You were so out of breath. Don't you remember? You were out of your depth in the countryside. That's because, Mum, I was 7 years old. I wasn't as fit as the two of you were at the time, and I didn't like being stung by a bee, and yes, I grazed my knee and slipped on a rock. I was eager to get back to my ballet classes because I was missing them. But I've grown since then, a wee bit, I think, since I last checked my reflection in the mirror. Now there's no need to be so sarcastic, Eugenie. Think about this for a moment. What about little Emmy? Is she going to have the freedom of a choice in Montana that she can so thoroughly enjoy here in New York, when opportunities are boundless? I don't think so, sweetheart. As a little girl, you engaged in all kinds of extracurricular activities that you loved. You did so many things, didn't you? But what can you do in Montana? I think choices will be incredibly limited for poor little Emmy. For goodness sake, Mum. You're talking as if I'm going to live in an old American town in the 1800s, that I'm going back in time or something. I'd like to think that things have moved on beyond the days of horse and carriages and sending your kid to school with a bucket and pail. I promise you, Mum, country towns have a lot of opportunity for kids these days. They're not what they used to be. Things are modern and sophisticated these days. even if they are in the sticks. And for your information, I noticed there was a ballet studio in the town for Emmy when she's older. So your point is, she said, raising an arched quizzical eyebrow, as if to challenge her mother. My point is, sweetheart, that you need to think about this properly. You're like a frog jumping from a very big pond into a tiny one. Isn't that going to be insufferable for you, when you're used to a place that's so large, so big and thriving, so full of fabulous opportunities for everyone? Who says New York is the big pond? Eugenie challenged her parents. Supposing Montana is the big pond, and New York is the little one. You could have it the wrong way round. Her mother shook her mane of auburn curls indignantly, eyeing her daughter through fierce blue eyes. Sometimes, Eugenie, you can be mulishly stubborn, just like your father. There is no reasoning with you. I can see you've made your mind up about moving to Montana, but don't you dare come running back to me when everything falls apart for you. Your life is going to require great adjustment. Moving to a new place is not so clear-cut as you think it is. So there we are. That's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.